October 24th, 1948, 3:17 p.m., 125th Street and 7th Avenue, Harlem. Albert Anastasia crossed the curb without slowing his stride. Traffic paused around him. Pedestrians moved aside instinctively, not because they recognized his face, but because men like him carried their own gravity. He had flown in that morning. No announcement. No entourage large enough to draw attention. Just enough muscle to make sure he walked out the same way he walked in. He did not come to negotiate territory. He came to test reality. For 2 decades, Anastasia had enforced power for the Italian underworld with a simplicity that terrified even his allies. Problems were not debated. They were removed. Men who crossed him did not become stories. They became absences. And now he was standing in Harlem, in daylight, inside a neighborhood that did not belong to him. Bumpy Johnson was already aware. Word had traveled ahead of Anastasia's shoes. A man like that never arrived unnoticed. The question was not whether something would happen. The question was what kind of violence Harlem would tolerate, and what kind it would reject. Anastasia kept walking. He entered a cafe on the corner, took a seat near the window, and ordered coffee. No threats. No raised voices, no gun drawn, just presence. By nightfall, everyone in Harlem would understand what that walk meant. And by morning, the balance of power between 2 worlds would quietly, permanently shift. Harlem was not neutral ground. By 1948, Harlem was not a frontier. It was a controlled environment. The numbers racket fed thousands. Street crews answered to policy bankers. Policy bankers answered to Bumpy Johnson. Violence existed, but it was regulated, targeted, and rarely public. Outsiders could make money there, but only with permission. That structure was not theoretical. It was enforced daily, quietly, by men who understood that chaos attracted police, and police destroyed profit. Harlem's power did not announce itself with uniforms or banners. It lived in routines. And who collected on Tuesdays? In which storefronts stayed open late without being touched? In which disputes were settled with conversation instead of gunfire? The system worked because it reflected the neighborhood it ruled. Most of the money came from Harlem residents. Most of the protection came from Harlem men, and most of the consequences when lines were crossed stayed inside Harlem. Bumpy Johnson sat at the center of that system without advertising his position. He did not run Harlem like a conqueror. He ran it like a custodian. That distinction mattered. He did not squeeze every dollar out of the numbers game. He kept the percentages stable. He paid runners on time. He made sure families of arrested men were not abandoned. That was not charity. It was insurance. Loyalty in Harlem was not purchased with fear alone. It was maintained through consistency. Police pressure was constant. Raids happened. Arrests happened. That was unavoidable. What Bumpy managed was scale. No massacres. No public executions. No sensational headlines that brought in federal attention. When violence was necessary, it was decisive and contained. A man disappeared. A warning was delivered privately. A debt was resolved without a body left in the street. Harlem stayed profitable because Harlem stayed quiet. Italian crews had long understood this balance, even if they resented it. They made money in Harlem through partnerships, not occupation. They skimmed percentages. They ran side operations. They accepted that full control would cost more than it paid. For years, that understanding held, not because Harlem was weak, but because it was expensive to destabilize. By the late 1940s, however, pressure was building. Prohibition was gone. Old revenue streams were thinning. New rackets were crowded. Harlem's numbers money still moved in cash, still turned daily, still flowed in volumes that tempted men who believed fear alone could unlock it. Those men tended to underestimate how much memory a neighborhood carried. Bumpy Johnson remembered earlier incursions. He remembered Dutch Schultz's ambitions and how they ended. He remembered which Italians negotiated and which ones threatened. Harlem remembered, too, the shop owners, the runners. The musicians paid in cash at the end of the night. They knew who protected their income and who disrupted it. That collective awareness formed a barrier more effective than any gunman. Neutral ground implies openness. Harlem was not open. It was selective. Men passed through, but they did not impose themselves. Any outsider who mistook access for ownership learned the difference quickly, sometimes through a conversation, sometimes through a sudden loss of business, occasionally through a beating that left no witnesses and no complaints filed. What made Harlem dangerous to misunderstand was not its capacity for violence, but its patience. The neighborhood did not react immediately. It observed. It waited to see whether a provocation was a mistake or a policy. That delay gave Bumpy Johnson leverage. The first man to force escalation usually revealed desperation. Bumpy preferred to let the other side show its hand. By 1948, this balance had hardened into expectation. Harlem expected to be consulted, expected disputes to be framed, not forced, expected that anyone powerful enough to enter openly would also be disciplined enough to leave without blood. When those expectations were violated, the response was not emotional. It was structural. That was the environment Albert Anastasia stepped into. Not chaos, not weakness. A system already in motion, already profitable, already defended by loyalty rather than noise. Anyone walking into Harlem without understanding that reality was not entering neutral ground. They were entering someone else's order. Albert Anastasia did not ask permission. Albert Anastasia had never respected invisible borders. As one of the most feared figures behind Murder, Inc., he believed power was proven through action, not recognition. When Italian interests began pressing north for more control over Harlem's money flow, Anastasia volunteered himself as the message, not a letter, not a lieutenant himself. Walking in meant something else entirely. It meant he believed Harlem would blink. Anastasia's reputation had been built on certainty. When he moved, things ended. Men who dealt with him understood that negotiations were brief and outcomes final. He did not posture or threaten publicly. He arrived, observed, and decided. That decision usually left no room for response. For 2 decades, that approach had worked because his enemies rarely had time to organize against it. He was not reckless. That misconception followed him because the results of his actions were often brutal, but Anastasia calculated risk carefully. He chose moments where surprise and speed outweighed numbers. He understood fear as a currency that lost value if overused. His presence alone in the right place could accomplish what gunfire could not. Harlem, however, was not the right place for that formula to work cleanly. Anastasia knew this. That knowledge was part of why he went himself. Sending a subordinate would have invited delay, discussion, and reinterpretation. Walking in removed ambiguity. It forced Harlem to respond to the highest possible level of pressure without violence being initiated. Italian leadership had debated the move quietly. Some argued that Harlem's system was stable and profitable enough to leave untouched. Others believed Bumpy Johnson's influence had grown too comfortable. Comfort bred resistance. If Harlem could be made to acknowledge Italian supremacy publicly, the numbers' money would follow. Anastasia represented the faction that believed hesitation cost more than confrontation. He did not arrive announcing demands. That would have been a concession. Demands acknowledged the other side's authority to refuse. Anastasia preferred demonstrations. A public appearance, calm and unchallenged, would communicate more than any threat. If he could sit in Harlem in daylight, without consequence, the message would ripple outward on its own. His men expected violence. They were prepared for it. They had cleared routes, arranged cover, and identified exits. Anastasia did not discourage that readiness, but he did not rely on it. If guns came out, it would mean something had gone wrong. Violence was not the objective. Submission was. There was also personal pride involved, though Anastasia would never have named it as such. He had risen from dockside enforcer to national figure without ever conceding ground. Every territory he entered bent eventually. Harlem represented a challenge to that pattern. Allowing it to stand untouched implied limits. Men like Anastasia did not accept limits easily. What he underestimated was not Harlem's capacity for retaliation, but its tolerance for silence. No one rushed to confront him. No intermediaries appeared offering compromise. No warning shots were fired. The absence of reaction disrupted the script Anastasia had rehearsed internally. Pressure without response lost clarity. At raised questions he preferred not to entertain. As he moved through the neighborhood he noted details. Faces that watched without staring. Conversations that paused and resumed without panic. No sudden dispersals. No hurried shutters. Harlem was not reacting like a place under threat. It was observing him as a variable, not an invader. That observation mattered. Anastasia understood environments. He knew when he was being hunted and when he was being evaluated. Harlem felt like the latter. The longer he remained without escalation, the clearer it became that permission was not being sought because permission was not relevant. Harlem did not need to grant it. Harlem could absorb him temporarily without yielding anything permanent. Walking in had been a test. The question was no longer whether Harlem would blink. It was whether Anastasia's presence alone was enough to force a decision. And for the first time in a long while, the answer was not immediate. Bumpy Johnson let him walk. Bumpy Johnson did not rush to confront Anastasia. That restraint was deliberate. Harlem watched how long Anastasia would remain unchallenged, and Anastasia watched for the response he did not receive. No shooters. No warnings, no public insults. Just silence. In Harlem, silence was not weakness. It was calculation. Bumpy understood that the first man to move usually revealed his fear. Bumpy had learned patience early. Prison had taught him that men who reacted quickly often lost control of the outcome. Harlem had reinforced the lesson. Power there was not exercised through sudden displays. It was exercised through timing. By allowing Anastasia to walk, Bumpy shifted the burden of action onto the outsider. Every step Anastasia took without interference increased the cost of his next move. There were men around Bumpy who wanted immediate confrontation. They understood Anastasia's reputation and feared what his presence signaled. A decisive show of force, they argued, would end the uncertainty. Bumpy listened without agreeing. He knew that violence chosen too early rarely stayed contained. Harlem could win a gunfight. What it could not afford was a war fought on someone else's schedule. Instead, Bumpy let the system work. Word moved through the neighborhood without panic. Runners were told to stay visible. Crews were told to hold their positions. No one was to provoke. No one was to hide. Normalcy became a statement. It told Anastasia that Harlem was not scrambling to respond. It already had a response. Bumpy positioned himself where he could see without being seen. He did not need to be in the street. His presence was understood. Men checked in. Updates came quietly. Anastasia's movements were tracked, not interfered with. That surveillance was not for an attack. It was for assessment. Bumpy wanted to know whether Anastasia was searching for a trigger or a concession. By doing nothing, Bumpy forced Anastasia into a dilemma. Violence would make Anastasia the aggressor in a neighborhood prepared to unify against him. Withdrawal would look like restraint, not retreat. Either choice reduced Anastasia's leverage. The longer the standoff continued without incident, the clearer it became that Harlem controlled the tempo. This approach carried risk. Anastasia was not known for hesitation. Allowing him freedom of movement meant accepting the possibility that he would strike unpredictably. Bumpy weighed that risk against the certainty of escalation if Harlem fired first. He chose uncertainty over inevitability. That choice defined the moment. Bumpy also understood symbolism. A public confrontation would reduce the encounter to personalities. A quiet one elevated it to systems. If Anastasia left without bloodshed, the story would not be about Bumpy's restraint. It would be about Harlem's stability. Stability discouraged future incursions more effectively than violence. As hours passed, the absence of incident became noticeable. Men who expected sirens heard traffic. Storefronts stayed open. The neighborhood did not hold its breath. That calm spread outward. It suggested confidence. Confidence unsettled outsiders more than threats. Anastasia, for all his experience, was now operating inside Bumpy's preferred terrain. Every choice he made was visible. Every pause was interpreted. Bumpy did not need to confront him to assert authority. He needed only to demonstrate that Anastasia's presence changed nothing. Letting him walk was not mercy. It was positioning. Bumpy was shaping the narrative before any words were exchanged. If and when they spoke, it would not be as challenger and defender. It would be as two men acknowledging boundaries already proven in practice. By the time Anastasia realized that silence itself had become the response, the advantage had shifted. Harlem was no longer reacting to him. He was reacting to Harlem. And Bumpy Johnson had not said a word. The meeting that was never scheduled. The encounter did not happen in a back room or at a table arranged by intermediaries. It happened because Anastasia chose visibility and Bumpy allowed proximity. They sat within blocks of each other for hours without exchanging words. That alone unsettled both crews. Men who ruled through violence were now trapped inside restraint. Every minute passed raised the cost of escalation. Anastasia had expected some form of contact. a messenger, a warning, an invitation framed as a courtesy but delivered as a demand. None came. Instead, he found himself occupying space in a neighborhood that continued operating as if he were incidental. That was not indifference. It was discipline. Harlem was demonstrating that it did not need to acknowledge him to contain him. Bumpy Johnson, for his part, did not seek a private audience. He understood that meetings created records, even when undocumented. A backroom conversation could be misrepresented later as submission or compromise. Proximity without engagement allowed both sides to read each other without committing to language that could be twisted. Their crews felt the pressure differently. Anastasia's men were conditioned to act. Restraint was not their strength. Standing down while their boss remained exposed in unfamiliar territory went against instinct. They scanned faces, hands, doorways. Each unbroken hour increased their attention. Prepared violence with no release corrodes morale. Harlem's men experienced a different strain. They were used to order, not paralysis. Allowing a man with Anastasia's reputation to remain unchallenged tested their trust in Bumpy's judgment. But they held that loyalty was not blind. It was earned over years of decisions that favored the neighborhood's survival over personal pride. The absence of a scheduled meeting forced an unscripted evaluation. Anastasia observed how Harlem responded to his presence. No sudden changes in routine. No visible reinforcements flooding the streets. The system absorbed him without distortion. That suggested depth. A shallow operation would have overreacted. Harlem did not. Bumpy observed something else. He watched how Anastasia handled the lack of engagement. Whether he sought attention, whether he manufactured a reason to act, he did neither. That restraint signaled that Anastasia understood the stakes, even if he did not yet accept the limits. At no point did either man formally summon the other. That omission was deliberate. A summons implied hierarchy. Neither was willing to grant it. Instead, the meeting existed as a shared awareness. They knew where the other was. They knew they could reach each other if necessary. Choosing not to was the statement. As time passed, the neighborhood became the mediator. Its continued calm applied pressure more effectively than threats. Any violent act would now be measured against hours of restraint. It would appear excessive, uncontrolled. The longer the peace held, the more costly its disruption became. Anastasia understood optics. He had built his power by controlling narratives after the fact. Here, the narrative was forming without him. If he acted, he would be the one to break equilibrium. If he left, the story would emphasize that Harlem did not bend. Bumpy's advantage was not that he could outgun Anastasia. It was that he could outweight him. Patience in this context was a weapon. It denied Anastasia the clarity of conflict. It forced him to consider outcomes beyond immediate dominance. By late afternoon, the unspoken meeting had concluded without ceremony. No handshake, no agreement, no concession. Just two men occupying the same city, aware of each other, and choosing not to collide. That choice mattered. It established a precedent more durable than a deal. Power had been measured without blood. Boundaries had been tested without words. And both sides left understanding something new about the other, without ever sitting across a table. Violence was considered and rejected. Anastasia's men expected blood. They were prepared for it. They knew their boss's reputation was built on finality. But Harlem was not a dockyard or a warehouse. It was populated, observant, and loyal to its own. Any public violence would not isolate Bumpy Johnson. It would mobilize Harlem against the Italians. Anastasia saw that clearly enough to hesitate. Hesitation for a man like him was rare. The option of force was discussed without being spoken aloud. Routes were mapped. Lines of fire were considered and dismissed. Any strike would have to be fast, precise, and decisive. But Harlem offered no clean angles. Too many eyes, too many variables. A single misstep would turn a calculated act into a public disaster. Anastasia had built his authority by choosing environments that favored his methods. Warehouses closed at night. Docks where men worked in isolation. Back rooms where witnesses were controlled. Harlem in the afternoon offered none of those advantages. Violence there would not end with the target. It would ripple outward, drawing in men who did not need orders to respond. His crew felt the tension. Their readiness had become a liability. Standing on edge for hours dulled focus. The longer they waited, the more exposed they felt. This was not their territory. Every unfamiliar face was a potential informant or ally of Bumpy Johnson. Acting first might have felt decisive, but it would have surrendered strategic ground immediately. Anastasia weighed the consequences beyond the immediate. A killing in Harlem would not stay local. It would invite retaliation in places he did control, restaurants, social clubs, meetings he could not fortify without drawing attention. War with Harlem would not be contained. It would bleed into the broader Italian underworld, forcing alliances and divisions that carried long-term costs. There was also the matter of legitimacy. Anastasia was feared, but fear alone did not sustain empires. He operated within a network that valued stability when profit depended on it. Unnecessary conflict invited scrutiny from law enforcement and rival factions alike. Harlem's numbers money was attractive, but not at the price of destabilizing New York's balance. Bumpy Johnson understood this calculus even without direct communication. By maintaining calm, he forced Anastasia to confront the full cost of violence. Any aggressive move would appear unprovoked. Harlem had not challenged him publicly. It had not insulted him. It had simply continued functioning. That made escalation harder to justify to allies and superiors. Their rejection of violence was not moral, it was tactical. Anastasia did not spare Harlem out of respect. He spared it because the equation no longer favored him. Power, in that moment, meant choosing not to act when action would weaken position. As daylight faded, the window for a clean strike closed further. Night brought crowds, movement, unpredictability. The longer Anastasia remained without incident, the more obvious it became that violence would now look reactive rather than authoritative. That distinction mattered to a man whose reputation depended on control. For Harlem, the absence of blood validated Bumpy's strategy. His men saw that restraint did not invite weakness. It imposed discipline on the outsider. The neighborhood's unity had become a shield, not through force, but through coherence. By rejecting violence, Anastasia acknowledged a limit without naming it. He recognized that some territories could not be taken by fear alone. Harlem was one of them. That realization did not diminish him, it refined him. When he eventually left, it was not under pressure of threat, but under weight of consequence. Violence had been considered carefully, and set aside. The decision was quiet, but its impact was lasting. Harlem remained intact, and the message traveled without a single shot fired. Bumpy's advantage was not muscle. Bumpy Johnson did not match Anastasia in raw brutality. He surpassed him in something else, control of environment. Every face on the street was a potential witness. Every delay favored Harlem. Bumpy understood that dominance was not about killing the other man. It was about making sure the other man could not win, no matter how violent he chose to be. Bumpy's authority was built on familiarity. He knew which corners stayed busy through the afternoon and which emptied at dusk. He knew which shopkeepers talked to police and which ones closed ranks without being asked. That knowledge was not abstract. It had been collected over years of walking the same streets, settling the same disputes, protecting the same flows of money. Harlem was not just territory to him. It was terrain he understood instinctively. Anastasia operated best where variables were minimized. Bumpy thrived where they multiplied. Crowds diluted force. Noise obscured intent. Delay introduced doubt. By allowing the environment to remain active, Bumpy ensured that any aggressive move would be seen, discussed, and remembered. Violence in Harlem would not disappear into silence. It would echo. Bumpy did not need to issue orders to create this effect. The neighborhood already knew how to behave when pressure arrived. People went about their routines deliberately. They did not scatter or gather. That calm communicated readiness without provocation. It told Anastasia that Harlem was neither frozen nor frantic. It was prepared. This environmental control extended to information. Anastasia's movements were known quickly, not because Harlem had spies in his crew, but because he could not move without being noticed. Children running errands, men standing in doorways, drivers waiting at lights. None of them needed instruction. They observed because observation was part of survival. By the time Anastasia reached a corner, Bumpy already knew. Bumpy also understood timing as leverage. He did not seek resolution. Resolution implied closure, and closure invited renegotiation. Instead, he let the situation remain open just long enough to exhaust its usefulness to the outsider. The longer Anastasia stayed, the less pressure his presence exerted. Novelty faded. Familiarity replaced fear. Anastasia's reputation depended on decisive outcomes. He arrived to force a reaction. What he encountered was absorption. Harlem did not push back. It simply incorporated his presence into its daily rhythm. That stripped his appearance of urgency. Power that could not compel change lost its edge. There was a quiet confidence in that approach. Bumpy did not need to demonstrate strength because the environment demonstrated it for him. Any attempt by Anastasia to assert dominance would have required altering the surroundings. That alteration would have revealed intent and invited response. By keeping Harlem unchanged, Bumpy controlled the narrative without speaking. This was not passivity. It was containment. Anastasia could move, but only within boundaries he did not define. He could observe, but not influence. He could consider violence, but not deploy it without consequence. That limitation mattered more than any physical confrontation. Bumpy's men understood this advantage. They did not crowd Anastasia or shadow him openly. That would have acknowledged him as a threat. Instead, they remained where they belonged, The environment did the watching. The environment did the signaling. By the time the day wore on, the imbalance was clear. Anastasia's capacity for violence remained intact, but its utility had been neutralized. Bumpy had achieved what brute force could not. He had created a situation where escalation guaranteed loss. Dominance in that moment was not measured by who struck first or hardest. It was measured by who dictated the conditions under which force could be used at all. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson because it answered to him instinctively, and as long as that remained true, no outsider, regardless of reputation, could truly win there. The walk back out. Late that afternoon, Anastasia stood, paid for his coffee, and walked back onto 125th Street. No shots followed. No insults were exchanged. The absence of violence became the story. Men whispered not about what happened, but about what did not. Anastasia had entered Harlem and left intact, but unchanged. That distinction mattered more than any body count. His departure was unremarkable by design. No sudden movement. No protective rush. He walked as he had arrived, measured and visible. That visibility was important. Leaving quietly without incident confirmed that the situation had resolved itself without concession, but it also confirmed something else. Harlem had not needed to force him out. For Anastasia's men, the walk carried a different weight. They had spent hours braced for action, reading faces, anticipating signals that never came. Now they followed him out with their weapons unused and their questions unanswered. They were trained to interpret outcomes through violence. This outcome offered none. That ambiguity lingered. Back inside Harlem, life continued without pause. Storefronts closed on schedule. Traffic resumed its pattern. There was no celebration, no victory claimed. Bumpy Johnson did not announce anything. He did not need to. The neighborhood understood what restraint signified. Stability had been maintained without exposure. The story traveled quickly, but it traveled inaccurately by design. No single version dominated. Some said Anastasia had come to make demands, and found no audience. Others said he had come to assess and found no weakness. Both interpretations served Harlem's interests. Neither suggested submission. What mattered was what did not happen afterward. No Italian crew pressed deeper. No tribute was demanded. No retaliation followed. Silence extended beyond the afternoon into the following days. In the underworld, sustained silence after a challenge signaled resolution. Anastasia returned to his territory with the same reputation he had carried in. But something subtle had shifted. His authority remained unquestioned within his own sphere. Outside it, limits had been clarified. Harlem was not hostile, but it was not open. That boundary had been demonstrated, not declared. For Bumpy Johnson, the walk back out validated a long-held belief. Power preserved through restraint outlasted power, asserted through spectacle. He had not needed to defeat Anastasia publicly. He had only needed to deny him the outcome he sought. Men who observed the encounter drew their own conclusions. Some saw Anastasia's restraint as wisdom. Others saw it as recognition of cost. Few interpreted it as weakness. The nuance mattered. Respect in the underworld often rested on knowing when not to act. Harlem's position hardened quietly. Partnerships continued under existing terms. Italian interests adjusted expectations without confrontation. The numbers money kept moving. Police attention remained manageable. The system held. In later years, men would reference that afternoon as an example of how power could be tested without blood. Not as legend, but as precedent. It demonstrated that dominance did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply refused to be altered. Anastasia had walked into Harlem to see whether presence alone could bend it. He walked out knowing it could not. That knowledge did not diminish him. It informed him. And Harlem, unchanged on the surface, had confirmed something about itself. It did not need to prove ownership through violence. It already owned the terms. The walk back out closed the encounter without closing the file. Boundaries had been drawn invisibly, but they were understood. In the underworld, those were the lines that lasted. What Harlem learned that day. After that walk, Italian crews adjusted their expectations. Harlem would be partnered with, not absorbed. Bumpy Johnson's authority hardened without a single public execution. Anastasia returned to his world with a clearer understanding of limits. Power that day was not seized, it was acknowledged. And in the underworld, acknowledgment lasts longer than fear. The adjustment did not come through formal meetings or written terms. It appeared in behavior. Italian operators who worked Harlem routes became more careful in how they spoke and where they pressed. Percentages were discussed instead of assumed. Disputes were routed through intermediaries who understood Harlem's internal hierarchy. The absence of conflict became policy. For Harlem, the lesson was subtle but decisive. Outsiders could enter, but they could not overwrite the system. Presence did not equal authority. Reputation did not translate automatically across neighborhoods. Power had to be contextual. That understanding reinforced confidence among local crews and bankers. They did not need to escalate to be taken seriously. They only needed to remain unified. Bumpy Johnson's position changed in ways that were difficult to quantify but easy to feel. Challenges diminished. Questions about succession and loyalty quieted. Men who had watched him allow Anastasia to walk understood the calculation behind it. He had chosen outcome over ego. That choice increased trust. Trust in criminal structures reduced the need for enforcement. The police noticed nothing unusual. That, too, mattered. No spike in violence. No sensational arrests. Harlem stayed off the front pages. The city's attention moved elsewhere. Stability protected profit, and profit protected the people who depended on it. Bumpy's authority grew not because he expanded aggressively, but because he preserved continuity. Italian leadership internalized a parallel lesson. Harlem was not worth destabilizing. Its internal cohesion made it expensive to disrupt and difficult to dominate. Cooperation produced steady returns. Confrontation promised unpredictable loss. That calculus did not weaken Italian power. It refined it. Boundaries clarified roles. Anastasia's experience became an unspoken reference point. Not a warning, but a benchmark. Men understood that if someone with his reputation could enter Harlem and leave without altering it, then others should temper their ambitions accordingly. Fear still mattered, but fear now operated within defined limits. Harlem also learned something about restraint. Violence withheld could be as instructive as violence delivered. The neighborhood had demonstrated discipline under pressure. The discipline became part of its identity. It discouraged impulsive challenges from within as well as from outside. Order became self-reinforcing. Stories circulated as they always do. Some exaggerated, some minimized. The truth settled somewhere quieter. Two powerful men had measured each other without bloodshed. One had sought leverage. The other had denied it by refusing to change. That dynamic reshaped expectations more effectively than any public act. Over time, the memory of that day hardened into precedent. When future disputes arose, men referenced Harlem's response implicitly. Delay before escalation. Control before confrontation. Systems before personalities. Bumpy's approach outlived the moment because it could be replicated. The underworld rarely rewards patience. That day, it did. Harlem emerged not louder, but firmer. Its boundaries were no longer theoretical. They had been tested at the highest level and held. Acknowledgment traveled quietly. It did not announce itself. It appeared in decisions made elsewhere, in conflicts that never reached Harlem, in negotiations framed with deference rather than assumption. Fear fades. Memory does not. What Harlem learned that day was not how to defeat a powerful outsider. It learned how to remain itself under pressure. In environments built on dominance, that ability defines who lasts. And that lesson endured long after the footsteps on 125th Street had faded.